So in this video, I want to talk about the future of drone warfare because the Ukraine war has brought drone warfare to the fore and it's increasing and it's going to be the wave of the future. Now, I don't think it's going to look quite like the Terminator, but it's going to look like what's behind the Terminator with the actual flying drones and with sea drones and with crawling drones and things along those lines. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you two things. The first is Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. I believe he's at Stanford as he's talking about how he's had a hand in helping Ukraine with their drone warfare. And then I'm going to show you this article from Foreign Affairs magazine about how America isn't ready for the wars of the future and they have to really step up their game in AI and that sort of technology.
Well, let's talk about a real war that's going on. I know that something you've been very involved in is the Ukraine war, and in particular, I don't know how much you can talk about White Stork and your goal of having $500 drones destroy $5 million tanks.
So
how's that changing warfare?
So I worked for the Secretary of Defense for 7 years, and tried to change the way we run.
Now, before he gets into that, let's talk about that $500 drones destroying $5 million tanks. This has upended our previous understanding of what, like in World War I, tanks were, wow, that's amazing, they can do that. In World War II, tanks were the big player, right? Now, not so much. Tanks, I mean, it's good, but a drone can destroy it and they're vulnerable. And we used to think in terms of massing force. We can't do that the same way because a swarm of drones can come out and destroy that massed force. So it's very different now.
Run our military. I'm not a particularly big fan of the military, but it's very expensive, and I wanted to see if I could be helpful. And I think, in my view, I largely failed. They gave me a medal. So they must give medals to failure or, whatever. But my self-criticism was nothing has really changed. And the system in America is not going to lead to real innovation. So watching the Russians use tanks to destroy apartment buildings with little old ladies and kids just drove me crazy. So I decided to work on a company with your friend, Sebastian Thrun, and as a former faculty member here, and a whole bunch of Stanford people. And the idea basically is to do two things. Use AI in complicated, powerful ways for these essentially robotic war. And the second one is to lower the cost of the robots. Now you sit there and you go, why would a good liberal like me do that? And the answer is that the whole theory of armies is tanks, artillery, and mortar, and we can eliminate all of them.
So hear what he's...
Isn't that interesting? He can eliminate all of them. Like, they're outdated, they're outmoded, their shelf life is past. It's not that they won't be useful, but we have to get to something else. Okay, here's the weird Minecraft summary guy, and then we'll move on to the article.
He's talking about is that Ukraine has been able to create really cheap and simple drones. By spending just a couple $100s, Ukraine is creating 3D printed drones. They carry a bomb, drop it on $1 million tank, and they've been able to do that over and over again. So there's this asymmetric warfare happening between drones and more traditional artillery.
So that's where we're going to stop with the video, but I had to look it up and I found an article by Mark Milley and Eric Schmidt in August 5th of 2024. And they talk about the future of warfare and the future of drones and specifically AI and how prepared or unprepared we are for the warfare of the future. AI models are also helping Ukraine predict where to strike. Thanks to these systems, Ukrainian soldiers are taking out tanks and downing planes with devastating effectiveness. Undeniably true. Future wars will no longer be about who can mass the most people on the field, the best jets, ships, and tanks. Instead, they will be dominated by increasingly autonomous weapon systems and powerful algorithms. It will look like some sort of dystopian, futuristic sci-fi movie out there. It'll be significantly different than what we see when we look back to a Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers type of warfare. Unfortunately, this is a future for which the United States remains unprepared. The military has not yet embraced artificial intelligence. The Pentagon does not have nearly enough initiatives aimed at rectifying these failures, and its current efforts are moving too slowly. Meanwhile, the Russian military has fielded many AI-powered drones in Ukraine, And in April, China announced its largest military restructuring in almost a decade with a new emphasis on building up technologically driven forces. So, this is a consequence of the war in Ukraine. If it wants to remain the preeminent global power, the United States will have to quickly shift course. American policymakers, accustomed to governing the world's most powerful defense apparatus, may not like the idea of such a systemic overhaul, but robots and AI are here to stay. So, on the organizational side, it's going to take a lot to get them to change. It might take new leadership to come to fore before they do change, and hopefully that's not too late. The United States must therefore transform its armed forces so it can maintain a decisive military advantage and ensure that robots and AI are used in an ethical manner. But the character of war, how armies fight and where and when the fighting occurs and with what weapons and leadership techniques, can evolve. It can change in response to politics, demographics, and economics. And then they go through a catalog of things that have changed warfare over time, from saddles and horseshoes to chariots to the longbow to machine guns and steamships and radios, and the American Revolution with muskets and bayonets to the Civil War with rifle barrels, World War II with motorized vehicles and armored tanks, aircraft, and the radio. And then they said this: the Allies had to develop similar tactics and formations. They had to illustrate what one of us, Schmidt, termed innovation power, the ability to invent, adapt, and adopt new technologies faster than competitors. So, nuclear bombs were an example of that innovative power, but now we've got to get beyond that. And other countries seem to be quicker on the uptake than we are at this point. The Chinese military has already created an AI commander that has supreme authority in large-scale virtual war games, and China may eventually give AI models the authority to make choices, as might other states. Ukraine has already sought to hand over many dangerous frontline tasks to as many robots as possible to preserve scarce manpower, and that's what's driving much of this innovation. In the future, the first phase of any war will likely be led by ground robots capable of everything from reconnaissance to direct attacks. Ukraine's used robots for casualty evacuation and explosive disposal. The next generation of machines will be led by AI systems that use the robot sensors to map the battlefield, predict points of an attack. Even when human soldiers eventually intervene, they will be led by first-person view aerial drones that can help identify the enemy, as already happens in Ukraine. The automation of war could prove essential to saving civilian lives. Historically, wars were fought and won in open terrain where very few people live. But as global urbanization draws more people into cities and non-state actors pivot to urban guerrilla tactics, the decisive battlefields of the future will likely be densely populated areas. Such fighting is far more deadly and far more resource intensive. It will therefore require even more robotic weapons. Militaries will have to deploy small, maneuverable robots such as robot dogs on streets and flood the sky with unmanned aerial vehicles to take control of urban positions. They will be guided by algorithms which can process visual data and make split-second decisions without human interaction. Now, human control over that is going to be important in the future. The use of unmanned weapons is essential for another reason. They're cheap. An MQ-9 Reaper only costs a fourth of an F-35 fighter jet. This affordability could allow states to send swarms of drones, some designed to surveil, others to attack, without worrying about attrition. The affordability of these weapons will, of course, make offense much easier, in turn empowering frugal non-state actors. So bad people could get a hold of these just as well as good people. Today, Iranian-backed insurgents are using drones to strike U.S. air bases in Iraq. And the Houthis, the military group that controls much of Yemen, are sending drones to strike ships in the Red Sea. Their attacks have tripled the cost of shipping from Asia to Europe. Drones are helping groups beyond the Middle East and Africa as well. A ragtag coalition of pro-democracy and ethnic militias in Myanmar are using repurposed commercial drones to fight off the military junta's once feared air force. Drones could help Taiwan as well. Although Beijing is unlikely to launch a full-scale attack on the island in the next few years, Chinese President Xi has ordered his country's military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. To stop such an attack, Taiwan and its allies would have to strike an enormous number of invading assault craft within a very short time window. Unmanned systems on land, sea, and air may be the only way to do so effectively. Unlike the Ukrainians, who have mostly fought on land and in the air, Taiwanese will be reliant on underwater drones and autonomous sea mines that can quickly move around in the battle. And their aerial drones will have to be capable of longer flight times over larger stretches of ocean. Taiwan and its allies must manufacture them en masse. Now, no country has been producing the hardware it needs for robot weapons at scale, nor has any state created the software required to fully power automated weapons. Unfortunately, the United States' adversaries are in many ways in the lead. Now, Ukraine's in the lead, and behind them are Russia, Iran, and China in short succession. We're still trying to wrap our minds around this in the US. China dominates the global commercial drone market. The Chinese company DJI controls an estimated 70% of global commercial drone production. And because of China's authoritarian structure, the Chinese military has proved especially adroit at pushing through changes and adopting new concepts. Yet China and Russia are swiftly gaining ground. Washington has the resources to keep outspending them, but even if it maintains this lead, it could struggle to overcome the bureaucratic and industrial obstacles to deploying its inventions on the battlefield. As a result, the U.S. military risks fighting a war in which its first-rate training and superior conventional weaponry will be rendered less than effective. U.S. troops, for example, have not been fully prepared to operate on a battlefield where their every move can be spotted and where they can be rapidly targeted by drones hovering overhead. In fact, American doctrine would be to mass their forces for safety, but that's a recipe for disaster with drone warfare. The U.S. military would also be especially vulnerable in urban battlefields, where enemies can more easily sever U.S. communication lines and where many American weapons are less useful. Even at sea, the United States would be vulnerable to its adversaries' advances. Chinese hypersonic missiles could sink U.S. aircraft carriers before they make it out of Pearl Harbor. In the air, the capable but costly F-35 might struggle against swarms of cheap drones. So might the heavily armored Abrams and Bradley tanks on the ground. U.S. military planners are right to have concluded that the era of shock and awe campaigns in which Washington could decimate its adversaries with overwhelming firepower is finished. To avoid becoming obsolete, the American military needs to make major reforms. So first, it relies on 10-year procurement cycles. Now that makes sense because businesses have to, be able to adjust and that sort of thing. But what they really need to do is purchase from a wider pool of companies that are more tech savvy. The next generation of small, cheap drones are unlikely to be designed by traditional defense firms, which are incentivized to produce fancy but expensive equipment. They're more likely to be created, as they were in Ukraine, through government initiative that supports dozens of small startups. What Ukraine has done has been absolutely brilliant in bringing to bear the resources that it has in a decentralized way that allows this innovation to flourish. The United States will need to do more than simply reform the way that it purchases weapons. It must also change the military's organizational structures and training systems, giving greater autonomy to small, highly mobile units. And that's going to take some organizational changes, which the generals might not be that excited about. These units must be connected with new platforms such as drones so that they can be as effective as possible. Now, there are risks and rewards. Here's the risk. In the worst case scenario, AI warfare could even endanger humanity. War games conducted with AI models from OpenAI, Meta, and Anthropic have found that AI models tend to suddenly escalate into a kinetic war, including nuclear war, compared with games conducted by humans. It doesn't take much imagination to see how matters could go horribly wrong. And there was an example of this in 1983. The Soviet missile detection system falsely classified light reflected off clouds as an incoming nuclear attack, but a human soldier in charge of processing the alert determined it was a false signal and prevented nuclear war. But in the age of AI, there might not be a human to double-check the system's work. Now, there's also a place where we're on the same page. The United States and China have different global visions, but neither of them wants terrorists to gain possession of dangerous robots. They may also want to stop other states from acquiring such technology. Great powers that possess formidable military technology almost always have an overlapping interest in keeping it to themselves. So if China won't cooperate, the United States should ensure that its own military AI is subject to strict controls, keep them under human command. The next generation of autonomous weapons must be built in accordance with liberal values and universal respect for human rights, and that requires aggressive U.S. leadership. When U.S. leadership leaves, there becomes a vacuum and bad things happen. It's an illusion to think that technology will change the underlying human nature of the conflict. It won't. But the character of war is changing both rapidly and fundamentally, and the United States must change and adapt as well. So that's the Foreign Affairs article from Mark Milley and Eric Schmidt. Drone warfare has changed the character of warfare in Ukraine, and it's going to change the character of warfare in the future. We're only seeing what we're seeing in Ukraine is like what tanks did in World War I, and the next war will be what tanks are in World War II. Okay, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for listening to this, and if you have comments, please put them below. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes and the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.